welcome back. This is Lesson 7, the Great Depression. And as you no doubt notice from the textbook, we spend a lot of time studying the Great Depression. The Great Depression is taught in both chapters 4 and 6, and the textbook does a great job introducing it. So I am thankful that you already worked through the textbook and you've seen from the textbook some of the causes of the Great Depression. And no doubt you already began to collect, how did the U.S. government respond to it? And how did the Canadian government respond to it? So it's not my job to repeat everything that's done in this textbook. The textbook's done a great job, really truly beginning on page 144 with the welfare state and going on about the Great Depression and Keynesian Economics, and this will lead us up to page 149, and then they come back to it in chapter 6. In chapter 6, they go back to the Great Depression and they go into more detail about the causes of it and about the New Deal. Some of the factors before the Great Depression are on page 200 and 201. And then we have some of the causes of it leading up to page 205. And the New Deal is outlined on pages 208, 209. And then in Canada, it talks about it up to page 212. And then it talks about post-Great Depression economics in Canada with modern economic liberalism starting on page 214. And it even gets into neoconservatism, neoliberalism, and a rejection of Keynesian economics at the end of chapter 6. Again, chapter 4 and chapter 6 in that textbook are key chapters here. Please make sure you've read them. Make sure you've done those chapter questions. Look at the chapter question answer keys. Ask me questions about the textbook in our Hangouts if you need to. My job is to add to the textbook now. So, here with chapter 7. We're hoping that after this, lesson 7, hoping that after this lesson you'll be able to understand the many causes of the Great Depression. You'll be able to describe the transition from classic economic liberalism to modern through the use of, in America, FDR's New Deal. We'll hope that you can study the Great Depression in Canada and understand some of the related concepts like labor unrest and the growth of what will become the NDP, and look at contemporary similarities with some of the causes of the Great Depression. So, very ambitious. This Google document that I'm sharing with you has some notes provided for you. So, definitely read through these notes. It'll give you more insight into some of the causes of the Great Depression and some of the solutions created. So, in summary, when we look through those notes, we can see that some of the causes of the Great Depression come from classic economic liberalism. I'm going to begin by talking about buying on the margin. One of the causes of the Great Depression was speculation in the health of the stock market. People ended up investing in a market in which they had very little knowledge. It became more of a gambling experience. They looked at the past performance of stock and they thought that could predict future value, not knowing what the stock value actually was or the corporation's forecast actually was. So we had people jumping into a marketplace investing with very little knowledge. Now, if they're investing their own money and lost their own money, then the damage to the economy would have been limited, but there was a practice called buying on the margin where they could purchase stock by only having 10% down. So if they had $1,000, they could buy $1,000 of stock and not take out a loan, or they could put their $1,000 down and then take out a loan of $9,000 and buy $10,000 of stock. Now that would be a brilliant plan if the value of the stock kept going up. But because these stocks began to have price corrections in 1929, we end up seeing much of that money that was borrowed being lost on the stock market. And when the money was borrowed was being lost on the stock market, that meant that banks were losing money that they had lent out. So it wasn't just the investors that were losing money. It was people that had money in savings account that they thought was safe at their bank. That's one of the causes of the Great Depression. Another cause is a very similar thing happening in the rural areas of America. Many people misread that market too. They saw that following World War I, there was a great demand for American products to be sold, shipped, exported to Europe. France and England couldn't get enough of America's wheat. Well, that's because their economies had been destroyed to a greater extent due to the war, been disrupted. Much of the farmland of France, that was where the battlefields were. So for years, those farmers were just trying to transition back into industry. So during those years, the French people were buying products from Canada, by America, and Canadian and American farmers, they wanted to maximize their profit potential. They wanted to maximize their market share. So they took out loans. They bought more land. They took out loans. They mechanized their labor, thinking that the trend was going to be permanent, that the French and English, they're buying more of our wheat, and they would keep buying more and more wheat, and the price of wheat would keep going up. But there was a correction in that market too, when Europe was able to cut down on their imports, and no doubt in 1928, when the Soviet Union started to flood the market with their wheat, that too disrupted the price of wheat and began to collapse the house of cards on which these farmers in North America had bet. Now they had large tracts of land that they had borrowed money to purchase. They had equipment that they had borrowed to buy. They were in debt, hoping that they could pay for it based upon a projection of the value of their product, but now their product wasn't as valuable because there wasn't as much demand. So in many places in North America, that meant that they started over farming. So I need this much money. I can't make it with this much crop. I need more crop. And when you over farm your lands, you end up eroding the soil and creating a dust bowl. And that was another cause of the Great Depression. So in both the cities and in the countryside, one of the causes of the Great Depression is the nature of mankind. Mankind's irrational. Mankind can lack foresight, right? We can be selfish, and selfishness is meant to be a building block of capitalism. But here we're seeing that cornerstone is not sustainable. That's not a cornerstone for a society that has a future, because it'll lead to self-interest, will lead to greed and irrational choices that ended up destabilizing industries and markets like the stock market, and ended up creating a crash. Now, some looked at the crash of 1929 and said, well, this is just natural. We have a boom-bust cycle, that there'll be times of economic growth followed by times of economic recession. But when you're in a recession and prices are dropping and the value of labor drops, there's going to be a point where labor becomes affordable again and people start hiring those people back to work. Or prices become affordable again and people start buying those products again, and now the economy begins to grow again. And the boom-bust cycle is meant to be a natural business cycle. But others call it a very volatile cycle, a vicious cycle, because the boom-bust cycle, if uncorrected by the government, that despair can become overwhelming. And now people aren't hiring the workers back, and people aren't buying those products. And instead of recession, the economy begins to depress. And this depression becomes very deep and prolonged. So definitely read over your notes there on some of the causes of the Great Depression. And how would we use the causes of the Great Depression? We'd use it to expose how, due to the nature of mankind, just a completely free marketplace may not be in the best interest of society. That there needs to be regulation on things like the stock market, or regulation on things like financing and borrowing money in the finance industry. So At the time of the Great Depression, when it started in October 1929, Herbert Hoover was president of the United States. And his solution was to allow the marketplace to correct itself. He was a free market enthusiast, and therefore he didn't try to provide freedom through government. He wasn't a modern liberal. And because he was still practicing classic liberalism, for many people, the suffering became quite extreme. So what we've done here is we've created a fictional, because I wrote this, a fictional rant from the perspective of a radicalized American during this time. Definitely read through it and see if you can find an ideological perspective. See if you can find what is the goal of society? What is the problem holding it back? What are the values on which they want to build society? What can we infer about the relationship between government and governed that they're trying to build? And what kind of bias is there that others would reject? Who would reject it? And what kind of evidence would we use to reject it? And what kind of evidence would we use to further the perspective, promote it? And nearly 100 years later, is that rant correct or were they incorrect? Here's just some stats showing the bank failures. There were some failures before the Great Depression, October 29th, 1929, really the beginning of the stock market crash. But following that, we can see an explosion of banking failures to the point that once elected in 1932 and taking office in 1933, President FDR will end up declaring a banking holiday because when banks go bankrupt, you know you have a problem in the financial sector. Banks are in the industry. They're in the industry of generating profit. So when you have banks going bankrupt, maybe the government needs to regulate. So a big thing that we're going to look at is FDR's New Deal. And it is going to be important for you to be able to talk about the three main goals: to provide relief, recovery, and reform, but also to be able to not only talk about it holistically, but talk about it and specifically say, like, here's an agency, right? Here's an alphabet agency, and this is the goal. So, for example, one of the alphabet agencies is the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission. And the goal of the SEC was to ensure that the stock market crash in 1929 would not happen again, that the stock market would be regulated so that there wouldn't be less gambling on the stock market. Another specific alphabet agency that was created is the Civilian Conservation Corps. Put unemployed young men to work, paying them $1 per day, but also giving them food and lodging. So in an economy where there is no employer, the government becomes the employer. This is not classic liberalism anymore. This is modern liberalism. You can only be free if you have food and shelter. Those, in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these are essential needs, right? So in order to ensure that you have food and shelter, the government is creating an agency, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that is mainly going to do manual labor, creating some road repair and making some hiking trails so that we can ensure that you have a quality life. We're going to protect workers. We're going to regulate the economy. We're going to need to recover. Now, there's going to be critics. People on the right, okay? Remember back, the right is economically the domain of individualism. So people on the right are going to be alarmed that too much of the individualism is being pulled from America, that America is based on rugged individualism. The American dream is that you alone can find your destiny and plot your land and unleash your potential independent of government. Well, those on the right are looking at this new level of government involvement in the economy with skepticism and saying, "Oh man, this is socialism. This is horrible." Those on the left would be saying, "We haven't gone far enough. That we have done some minor reforms to the system, but the system itself is broken." Others would suggest that FDR was in violation of the separation of powers, that Montesquieu-like separation of power, that checks and balances, because he was packing the Supreme Court to force his legislation through. And he wasn't just being an executive branch, he was manipulating the legislative branch as well. So why was he so popular? One of the reasons he was popular was that he gave lots of speeches. So we have a link to some fireside chats. This is the fireside chat link is just as an aside. If you don't know much about the alphabet agencies after looking at the digital textbook and after looking at the physical textbook, then I would definitely go to that link. It's going to give you a nice little summary. There's the Williams video that you should have watched days and days ago. I keep talking about the difference between classic and modern liberalism, between negative and positive freedom. Negative freedom, again, is the idea that I need to be free from government, right? That government has a negative influence on my life. I want to be free from them. Positive freedom is the idea that I can be free through government. So this evolution of modern liberalism is outlined here. Key to the evolution is an economist named John Maynard Keynes, or Keynes. And Keynesian economics is the type of economic reform that FDR is suggesting for America. So this is a critical YouTube video to watch. Great depth, 12 minutes long. It is going to be a little difficult. It's at a higher level than high school level for economics, but definitely ask me some questions in our Hangout if you don't understand what they're talking about. Here's a summary of Keynesian economics, some notes for you that have been created. Key to Keynesian economics is the difference between fiscal and monetary policy. So two ways to manipulate the economy once you're going through that decline is through fiscal and monetary stimulation. So fiscal policy is taxing and spending. Now, in times when the economy is growing, if it's growing too rapidly and you fear that it's going to end up overheating and collapse, you can slow that economic growth by taxing it. If you increase taxes, you're going to slow growth. And if the government decreases spending, then they can also slow growth, keeping in mind the U.S. government's the biggest spender in the U.S. economy. But when you have an economic cycle that is beginning to bust, then how do you ensure that the bust is not severe, but you can pull out of the bust and go back to growth? Well, you decrease taxes and you increase spending. So taxing and spending is fiscal policy, and depending upon where you're at in the business cycle, you either increase taxes and decrease spending, or you decrease taxes and increase spending. So during a prolonged boom, you slow the economy by increasing taxes and decreasing government spending. And in order to speed up an economy, to recover the economy, you lower taxes to encourage spending, and the government increases spending. Another policy is monetary policy. Monetary policy is trying to manipulate the economy by ensuring that there's more money in circulation. How do you get more money in circulation? Well, the government during the New Deal ends up putting money in the hands of individuals. So maybe they're vouchers that you can use to go down to the grocery store and now get those apples that you need to survive. And when you go down to the grocery store using a government voucher and saying, I need some apples, then that stimulates work for the grocer, for the apple orchard, and for you. You get food. Monetary policy is typically seen, though, as manipulating interest rates, lending rates to try to see how much money is in circulation. And that's described here with the prime lending rates. So, good summary of Keynes. Another summary of FDR's New Deal. Lots of summaries here of FDR's New Deal for you. Some people didn't agree with the New Deal. Some people thought maybe the system before was good and we didn't need to change. Some people thought maybe FDR was acting unconstitutionally by pushing stuff through. Others would argue that the New Deal was only solved in America when America eventually went to war. Next up, we do look at Canada and the Great Depression coming to Canada. And again, we have some notes here for you to read through. Now, key with the Canadian case study will be the idea that it inspires labor unrest, and that the Prime Minister at the time, much like the President in the US, the Prime Minister at the time here in Canada, Prime Minister Bennett, did not respond with enough government aid to satisfy the people. So much like in the United States, where we have a presidential election and they end up switching from Herbert Hoover to FDR, in Canada, the people will, when given an opportunity in 1935, decide that Prime Minister Bennett and the Conservative Party weren't doing enough to help them, and they were going to vote in a more collectivist, not a collectivist, but a more collectivist Prime Minister and his party in Mackenzie King. And that's what's being described here. So Mackenzie King in Canada will introduce policies similar to what FDR did in America. So in this sense, Canada is a couple years behind. Here's some information about the growth of the CCF, and definitely places like Regina were some of those hotspots for socialist ideas during the Great Depression, because places like Regina were hardest hit by the Great Depression because of the impact it had on the agricultural industry. Here we have a cartoon from 1933 suggesting that the government's not doing enough, that these people are living in despair, and the government's offering them very little to sustain their lives. So many workers will seek government help. So there's a very famous operation called the On to Ottawa Trek. On to Ottawa Trek does pop up on the diploma exam, on the multiple choice at times. It could come up in an A1 as well. It'd be a great source for that. So we had some disgruntled workers that thought if they made their way to Ottawa, they could petition the government of Canada, the federal government, to provide reform and relief and recovery. And they made it to Regina. And in Regina, there's going to be a Regina riot. And during the Regina riots, the RCMP and the Regina police will end up using force to stop the On to Ottawa Trek. There's a nice little link here. And there's some photos of some labor disputes. Unfortunately, the Regina riot is not the last time we've seen labor being disgruntled to the point of being violent. So many people might have been looking at this and thinking, oh man, is this the beginning of a communist revolution? Labor unrest, right? Here's a cartoon that's being critical of Bennett, suggesting that Bennett is providing very little relief to those in need and providing a lot of relief to those who already have wealth. This is a cartoon that's suggesting that unemployment will end up taking the prime ministership away from Bennett, and the year is 1935, right before that election. Here's a cartoon suggesting that the electorate, the Canadian citizens, are looking at Mackenzie King and the Liberal Party as their savior because Prime Minister Bennett and the Conservatives are a horrible dancing partner because they have had nothing but unemployment and broken promises under the leadership of Bennett's Conservatives. There's a cartoon that shows the growth of some of the concerns that will lead to the CCF and the NDP because the classic economic liberal system of capitalism has led to low wages and sweatshops and unfair prices, and those laborers and farmers are looking at this system and finally realizing that uncontrolled competition, one of those values of individualism, has led to a flawed state. Here's that big tent of the CCF, the NDP being created, and it is a big tent in the sense that that's a grassroots movement that has many ambitions. There's a question there for you to go back and look at. Now, the fear that we have is that, unfortunately, some of the forces surrounding the Great Depression are still evident in society today. That here we have a look at the NASDAQ index, and you can see that much like the stock market in the 1920s, we have some very unsustainable boom periods. Same thing could be looked at the value of Bitcoin. and how that exploded and has crashed and has exploded and has crashed. And even in this last year of 2020, we've seen some pretty serious corrections in the stock market, as the stock market, fell in March of 2020 by about 1/3. These are not the only times in history where we've seen major corrections in markets because a market was somehow perverted by the irrational thoughts of mankind. And we can go back to tulip mania in 1634 to 1637 and look at how there was this artificial bubble created around the commodity of tulips, to the extent that people were selling their houses to buy tulips because they had their faith in tulips in the future, that tulips would unlock a better life. And guess what? The value of tulips, as you can see here, crashes. So tulip value, 1634, 1635, 1636. Look at it going up. We better buy in, right? Look how much it's going up. And people do buy in. It's going up. This would be a good time to sell. But you hang on. You get greedy, and then it collapses, and you go bankrupt. And in 1637, when you go bankrupt, there's not much of a government there to help you. So, not only did we look at the Great Depression today, but we also looked at the irrational nature of mankind. And due to the irrational nature of mankind, someone must govern the marketplace. So we need government regulation. Now, the difficulty is that it would be simple for us to assume that the government itself will be rational. So the government must be a transparent government, an accountable government that can regulate mankind's irrational nature in the marketplace. So our next lesson, we're going to look at what elements of the marketplace warrant government intervention. Definitely a lot of reading here. Definitely a lot of links in lesson 7 that I need you to go back and look at. But at the end of this lesson, I need you to be aware of the alphabet agencies, how they provided relief, recovery, reform, and be as specific as possible. Pick an agency and tell me what relief, recovery, reform they were providing. I need you to be able to talk about the Canadian case study and talk about the On to Ottawa trek, the Regina riots, the labor unrest, the broken promises that Prime Minister Bennett had offered, and the reforms that Mackenzie King had tried to provide. See you next time.